So now we're going to do the Q&A. So if you want to ask a question or make a short comment, raise your hand. I will repeat the question and then try to engage in conversation. So, yes?
How do you keep getting in?
So the question is, how do I keep getting in? That is a very good question. I actually had contacted Michael Sard because I was trying to line up an Israeli lawyer if I was going to get deported. I think it's because even though Israel presents itself as this huge security state, it actually doesn't know everything that the right hand and the left hand are doing. So I was really worried about being deported this time because I have a couple of friends who were deported from the airport. And I had all these things planned if that should happen, and I was going to fight it, and they just let me in. So I have no idea. Why did I get a permit to go to Gaza?
Gaza.
It's because they don't know what they're doing. There is a bill in the Knesset that passed that makes it legal for them to deport internationals that support boycott or that do human rights work. So, my days are limited, but I haven't risen up enough. I was on Israeli TV twice last year talking about boycott. I was sure this was my last trip, but I wasn't. So I don't know. They're not as powerful as they present. I will tell you a very funny story. So I was traveling with some women from Grassroots International, which is a donor group in the US that does community social activism focusing on issues of land and water. So we were visiting partner organizations in the West Bank and Gaza. So I'm traveling with a Haitian American who's very black and so was getting profiled at various Israeli security moments, and a Korean American, who's also a woman of color. So we're going to Erez, and I'm worrying about the Haitian American and the Korean American, and then I'm worrying about myself, although we all have the permits to get into Gaza. So they get in without any trouble. And then it's my turn, and I smile, my nice little face and my Rothchild name and everything, thinking there's going to be a piece of cake. And they won't let me in. There's all this chitter-chatter. The supervisor comes, and you've got this bulletproof thing, and you really can't communicate with this woman, and she's behind her computer, and finally she says, go sit down. I'm like, so I'm sitting there wondering if they're reading my website and my Facebook, and, totaling up all of my crimes, and thinking, I'm so close, it's just not going to happen. And finally, after the supervisor comes and they have this long powwow, they call me back, and it turned out that they accused me of falsifying my passport because they didn't think I was 68. And I was like, it was so I have that blog called Carded at Erez, So I said, it was a very good year, 48, and everybody laughed. But that was my trouble getting in. I was like, really? So you never know. It's really quite bizarre. The Israelis actually give you much more trouble leaving than getting in. And people routinely have this experience. And I had quite an experience leaving Erez and a bizarre experience leaving Ben Gurion. But it's harassment. It's not that they're actually going to, peel my fingernails off. It's just they want me to know that they don't like me being here. So the question is, how did I have my transformation? There's actually on my website. There's an essay that was published in the link. That's basically my story. So if you want the full, hour-long version, you could go look at it. But basically, I came from, a liberal Jewish family growing up in a small town. My parents are from Orthodox families. So I was very usual in terms of being a nice Jewish girl, getting Hebrew school 3 days a week, and, we saved money to buy trees in Israel and plant the desert groom and all that stuff. So I think for me, the first thing that happened was that I took the sort of messages about justice and democracy and fighting discrimination really seriously. So then, with that kind of innocence, I head off to college in the 60s. And, there's the Vietnam War. I get to medical school. I discover feminism. I discover healthcare reform. I discover the two-class healthcare system. I was a total science nerd. I start reading about colonialism. It was a shocking discovery. So I get educated on how the world actually works. And so for many years, that brain was here and my Israel brain was here, and the two of them did not ever have a conversation. And it was partly because I couldn't do it, and partly because there was no place for me to do it. Particularly in my family, there was no place to do it. But you can only tolerate so much cognitive dissonance in your life before you have to do something. So in the late 1990s, there were a group of us who were all in this similar place. We were all progressive activists, had done all this other kind of activism, and we felt like, there's something here and we need to figure it out. And we realized that there was going to be the 50th anniversary celebration of Israel independence in '98. And there was going to be this huge celebration in Boston on the Commons with Israeli bands and bagels and fireworks and blah, and we thought, well, let's see if we can do something about that. So we said, well, we'll do a peace forum. And we got this crazy idea to have a peace forum. And so we submitted a sort of fakaka plan to the Jewish community organization, and we were sure that they would say, go to hell, and then we were going to have a march. And that was the extent of our knowledge. And to their credit, they said yes. And then we were really stuck because we didn't know anything about it. We were from the 60s. You just have rallies, right? So we panicked, and then we realized that we had to get educated, and we really had to do this. So we started a Jewish-Palestinian dialogue group, and we started meeting, every couple of weeks, inviting every Palestinian academic, whatever, in the Boston area we could find. We met some very lefty Israelis, and we really educated ourselves quickly and powerfully. And it was so incredible to get that history and suddenly to kind of get it. And we pulled this thing off. We had 200 people in the middle of this total Zionist nationalist celebration. And we thought, well, we've got to share this information with our communities. So we were like, let's have a forum and let's do something at the library and blah, blah, blah. So we started doing that, and we were blacklisted rather quickly. And so then we started trying to figure out, well, this is obviously so painful and such a hot button issue that most of the people in our lives can't even begin to think about it. And a bunch of us realized we were all physicians. And so we said, well, one of the guys had done work in El Salvador, Solidarity Work, so we thought, well, maybe we could recreate that in Palestine. So we set up a health and human rights delegation and started taking people over once a year, working with Physicians for Human Rights Israel, Palestinian Medical Relief Society, and then it gradually became a ton of other human rights organizations. And so I just started going. And every time I went, it was like a piece of my soul got pieced back together. And I really began to get not only an education on the ground, but then I just started reading Ilan Pappé and every Israeli and Palestinian and academic that I could find. Again, really educating myself and also finding a community in which to do this. So finding a community, and particularly a Jewish community, was really great because at that point I was so far out of the community that I could be on Mars and I'd be closer. So it was really a sense of coming back to be whole. So it's actually been a very positive experience. And I'll just tell you, I had the department chief in my hospital, which was called Beth Israel Hospital, so you can imagine what that was like. It was actually founded because Jewish doctors couldn't get admitting privileges at the Brigham because of all the anti-Semitism in Boston. So anyway, so this chief had lived in Israel. He used to take docs over to tour the emergency facilities. He was like very rah-rah. And when I was going to start these delegations, I went to see him and I said, I'd really like to meet some Israeli doctors because I was curious, how do doctors deal with this stuff? And they have, Palestinian patients and Jewish patients and they have soldier patients, I wanted to get in and I thought maybe he could give me some names. And so we had this very civil conversation. And then when I asked him for some contacts, he refused. And I said, why? And he looked at me and said, because you are a danger to the Jewish people. So that was like the beginning of my really understanding that I was stepping very far out of the comfort place. But then I was really determined to do it. And it took about 5 years for him to leave. And every year I would ask, can I do grand rounds? I have a grand rounds on healthcare under occupation. It's like totally, UN statistics and my little photos, and it's very scientific. And that doctor got to talk about going to Afghanistan during an earthquake. How come I can't do this? And every year it was no, no, no. And finally he leaves, and I think, okay, here's my chance. So I put in my request to do grand rounds, and the acting chief says yes. So I'm like, so. When my grand rounds gets announced, it's something like the impact of war and occupation on health in the occupied territories. So the week it came out, they got 100 emails saying I should not be allowed to give grand rounds. So this is a hospital I've been in for 30 years, the people I trained, the people I'm training, and it was like, don't let her speak. And it was very wild because the department acting chief was very brave, and she said, I'm going to let you do this, but don't screw it up, And so It was quite amazing. 100 people came, everybody survived. It was a very scientific paper. But, that's kind of what the struggle is like every minute. And it's just been an amazing journey.
A follow-up question. What did your mother think?
What did my mother I ask this every day of my life. So my mother's a very interesting person because she was a Jewish writer. She wrote on the Holocaust. She wrote about the Jewish immigrant experience. She, was a big Hadassah lady. But she wasn't a dummy, And she was also a liberal. I mean, she taught in the inner city schools and all that kind of stuff. So she began to come to my events, which was very difficult for her. And one day she said to me, I'm proud of what you do, but you take it further than I can bear. And from what I got from all this was that she really understood that I was reporting the truth. But it was so painful to her that it broke her heart because she loved Israel. She would go to, in Jerusalem to these writing conferences, and my parents probably built half the state, they were big supporters, but it was a heartbreak for her. So it was very important for me to understand that part of it, because if we don't understand that part of it, we're not going to understand why people behave the way they behave. And then, she died in 2009, so she hasn't seen how far I've gone. I think she would be sort of painfully proud, but, she's sort of the outcast in the family anyway. So, my relatives, I have 2 cousins that talk to me, but, everybody else doesn't. So, it's that kind of very usual Jewish family situation. Yes. No. So is your question about what's going on in Israel or what's going on here? Both, okay. So first of all, let's do here. So what I find is that the more egregious the policies of the State of Israel are, the more difficult it is for liberal Jews to stand behind the State of Israel. And things just get more and more egregious. So I think you see this sort of squirminess going on because it's very hard to defend this if you believe in all the other things that liberal Jews believe in. The other thing is that the children of liberal Jews are not having it. And so if you look at the younger generations coming up, they don't march with Israel as a group. They don't support Israel right or wrong. And so their parents know this. So there's going to be a shift just because of the generations, but I also think that it's becoming much, much harder to defend the policies of the State of Israel. And so we are seeing that. And then I think the whole thing about the intersectionality, like, if our police are being trained by the occupying army in Israel and then come home and beat up kids in the ghettos, and use the tear gas that they're tear gassing the people in Berlin on black kids in Los Angeles. I mean, this gets very close to home. And so I think the intersectionality stuff is really important, and the Black Lives Matter stuff really makes it seem very less distant, okay? The other thing I think is that social media has played a huge role in people actually knowing what's going on. So a lot of things that happened that were invisible, they can't be invisible anymore. And between that and the internet and all the alternative news sources, we're just in a very, very different place than we were 20 years ago. The other thing that I think that's fascinating to me about this new not new, but the alt-right coming to a surface, is we now have this really crazy situation where we have people who are blatantly anti-Semites who are totally pro-Israel. And that's something you gotta wrap your brain around. So I'll tell you my theory about it. I mean, it's not my own, it's a theory I've evolved with, reading a million things. So if you're a sort of white nationalist, alt-right, we want to have the white Aryan nation type of guy, you don't like Jews, okay? And getting rid of them and having them all go home is really good for you because there's a Jewish problem in the US, and the way to get rid of them is to encourage them all to go to Israel. So you can be a complete ugly Nazi-like anti-Semite and be in the alt-right. But you love Israel because Israel is the US entry into the Middle East. It's a nation that has enshrined ethnic purity and done very, very well. It's very useful to US foreign policy. So you see this very odd combination of anti-Semite, pro-Israeli policy types. And they're in the ascendancy right now. And I don't think that most liberal Jews can tolerate that. I mean, it's a real, you don't want to get in bed with these people. So between that and the Christian right, pouring millions into the settlement movement, the lines are getting clearer about you've got to stand up or you're going to get run over, or you're going to, So it's a very interesting changing dynamic. In Israel, so what's going on in Israel in terms of what the Palestinians are saying, what the Israelis, so, I should not be speaking for Palestinians, but I can say that the Palestinians that I spoke to, basically, first of all, no one's talking one state, two state federation. That's not even on the table. People are saying, look, there is a one state, okay? There's Israel, there's all of the settlements, there's the Jordan Valley, which is a closed military zone. This is one state. It's an apartheid state. It's in a state with Jim Crow in Israel, but it's one state, let's be real. So the fight is an anti-apartheid fight. The fight is for human rights for everyone. And that's what the battle is about. So that is a very different discourse than like 10 or 15 years ago. There's also a lot of support for the boycott movement. It's like internationals, that is your job, go do it. And that's what we're being told by sort of activist Palestinians. The other thing is that many Palestinians that I work with feel very invisible. So, sometimes I feel like, am I doing sort of, occupation tourism? And they're like, no. Tell our stories, make this public, get it out there. People really don't feel like anyone's listening or hearing them. So the more that people of privilege, like a white lady who's Jewish, can do this, that serves the cause. And so I think you also get that message really quite strongly, particularly in Gaza, where people feel like they're just completely forgotten. And, there's sort of a competition of catastrophe with the Syrian refugees. What's worse off? A Gazan who's lived through 3 wars in 6 years, or a Syrian refugee? They're all in catastrophe, But so people feel like there's a competition for attention. And there's certainly a competition for money. And the other thing that's happening in Gaza with the donor groups that constantly rebuild Gaza, they're saying, why should we rebuild it? Israel's just going to bomb it. So the donor agencies have dried up a lot. And so you have a situation that's desperate. The Israelis severely restricting things like concrete and ways to rebuild your house. And then the donor agencies not wanting to give because it's just like pouring money down the toilet. And that creates another level of invisibility and crisis at the same time. Yes. So in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority is theoretically the government, okay? I'm using theoretically. And the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is Fatah, is the political party Fatah, which is Mahmoud Abbas. And what they have is that the West Bank is divided into 3 sections. And this is what happened in the Oslo Accords. So 65% of the West Bank is Area C. And Area C is under Israeli security and civil control. So 65% of the West Bank is totally under Israeli control, and that's where most of the settlements are being built. Area A is the Palestinian cities, and that is theoretically under total Palestinian Authority control, except that the Israelis reserve the right to come in and do whatever they want. And I've actually seen, I was there one day, when the Israelis were firing on Palestinians and the Palestinian Authority was defending the Israelis, and when the Israelis left, the neighborhood kids started stoning the Palestinian Authority forces. So, okay? And Area C, Area B, is all the stuff in between the villages. And in the villages, the Palestinian Authority has civil control, and the Israelis have military control. And there are villages, like in Be'elin, where the houses are on Area B, but the fields, the houses are in Area A, but the fields are in Area B. Or the fields are in Area B and the fields are in Area C and the houses are in Area B. So people, there's all sorts of very bizarre, I visited a mosque where half the mosque was in B and half the mosque was in C. So this kind of stuff makes people crazy. And also, it's a totally dysfunctional system. So under the Palestinian Authority, there's a Ministry of Health, there's a Ministry of Education. It looks like a government. But it's first of all, pretty corrupt. It's also largely collaborating with the Israeli forces. The Palestinian Authority spends more money protecting settlers than it does protecting Palestinians, okay? So there's not a lot of respect for the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. The problem is that there's a huge number of people that rely on the salaries that they get from the Palestinian Authority. the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education. Each person has a family with 6 kids and 10 grandchildren. And so it's sort of socked in that way because people need to eat. But there's a huge discontent with the system. And Hamas is not, it rumbles around in the West Bank, but it gets suppressed fairly quickly. In Gaza, Hamas is in charge, but it's a very dysfunctional place. Like, I have never seen a policeman. I've never seen a traffic cop. The Ministry of Finance was completely bombed to the ground in 2014, and there's no cement to rebuild it. I mean, it's not like there's this wonderfully functioning government that makes things happen. And there's this constant ridiculous war between Hamas and Fatah in Gaza. In fact, Gazans who are in Fatah are asked not to work because they get their salaries from the PA in the West Bank, and if they don't work, they'll get their salaries, and then a Gazan who's not in the Fatah can work the same job and get paid. It's that kind of like, are you kidding me? So it's a very dysfunctional place. It also has a Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, all that stuff, but this is not a civil society that's working. The only time I ever ran into someone that I knew was a real Hamas person was when you come into Erez, if you get through the Israeli security, then you go through Palestinian Authority security, and then you go through Hamas security. So you meet them there. And in 2014, I had a tour of southern Gaza, which is against Egypt, where all the tunnels used to be. And we were told, the tunnels have all been bombed in the war, blah, blah, blah. And we're met by these guys, black, big Kalashnikovs, and they ask us if we want to see a tour of the tunnels. So we say, why not? And they say, no pictures. And we say, okay. And they took us to 2 tunnels. One of them we walked in and took a walk down the tunnels until I had a major anxiety attack and left. But if we kept walking, we would have ended up in Egypt. And clearly this was Hamas. And one of the things I would do was say, who's in favor of Hamas here? Tell me. So I'd love to talk to someone from Hamas. And no one would admit to being in favor of Hamas. And I think that partly it was because I was in the civil society, human rights-y world. I think also because Hamas was very popular during the war because it was giving Israel the finger. But after the war, it's a total catastrophe, so it's not very popular. But what one woman pointed out to me was that no one was going to admit to me that they were in favor of Hamas. Because what if I wrote a blog post? What if I had a picture of them that went up on Facebook? What if? They could be targeted, assassinated. So it was in no one's interest for them to admit to me that they would be in favor of Hamas. I don't think I did meet anyone, but no one would tell me. I'm not the person who would tell. So that's my understanding. So the right of return is discussed all the time amongst Palestinians. And the right of return is a right guaranteed by international law that people who've been expelled involuntarily from wherever they're living have a right to return to it. And the Israelis have made it very clear that they are not going to honor that. And one of the ways they made that clear was by demolishing 550 villages in 1948 and expelling 750,000 people and making it impossible for them to come back. And then they did a similar thing in 1967. I think about 200,000 were expelled. So from the Israeli point of view, or the Israeli government point of view, and most Jewish Israelis, the right of return is a non-starter because it will change the Jewish nature of the state. And there's this fear that millions and millions of Palestinians will come flooding in and God knows what will happen. If you talk to Palestinians, particularly those living in the refugee camps, the right of return is one of the foundational things that has to happen for there to be any kind of peace in this region. And if you look at the sort of academic studies about, there have been conferences on how to actualize the right of return and all this kind of stuff. And what I get from it is that, first of all, Palestinians in general want an acknowledgement that this happened. They want an apology that this happened. So this is in the truth and reconciliation kind of style. And they want to have a choice of taking compensation or going back. Now, 99% of Palestinians, I think, know that they're not going to go back to Baba's house, that house either doesn't exist or Saj Moshe lives there, and, kicking out Moshe is not going to be the solution to the problem. So I think what people have talked about a lot is some combination of compensation and return. I mean, there are villages that are just forests, so you could rebuild that village if you had the political will. It's also pretty clear that I don't think most Palestinians would go back, because it would be a really tough place to live. But they want to get the other things recognized. They want financial recompensation and to move on beyond the camps. And a lot of the people who are in the camps are basically trapped from poverty and lack of options. Because people don't like living on top of each other and that kind of thing. And as soon as people get an education, then they have a house right outside the camp, or they live in, the Emirates. Or you see people worming their way out, and there's a big brain drain. But it has to be dealt with in some way that there's enough justice given that people can feel compensated and acknowledged, and be able to move to the next place. And it does bring up this whole issue of the Jewish nature of the state, and what do we do with that? And so that's a really tough one for Jewish Israelis to even think about. And sometimes I think, you're just worried they'll do to you what you did to them, And I don't think that would happen. I really don't. But it's a total non-starter in Israel. I mean, you want to get in a big fight, just say right of return and, yes. So the question is, are people able to retain their refugee status if they leave the camp? I think you retain your refugee status even if you leave the camp. Yeah, you're registered with the UN, with UNRWA, and you have refugee status. And so I don't think you have to stay in the camp. I mean, the amount of poverty in the camps is pretty overwhelming. So most people don't get up in the morning and think, gee, should I move or not? They're stuck there. And so you don't have to stay in the camp. It's very complicated because a lot of refugees are stateless. I mean, first of all, if you live in Palestine, you're stateless. There's so many stories of people at airports and they say, where do you live? Jenin. Where is that? Palestine. They look in there's no Palestine. Jordan? No. Palestine. They don't live, they're stateless. So the statelessness question happens to people whether or not they have refugee status. But Jordan each country was different. Jordan granted Palestinians Jordanian citizenship, some of them, but some countries absolutely will not, like Lebanon is totally hostile, and Syria doesn't. So each country has its own issue.
And is that issue wrapped up in the right of return, or is that a separate?
Of course. I mean, if you were stateless, wouldn't you want to have a place to return to? I mean, it adds power to the need to have to realize the right of return. One more question, and then we'll. I think one of the things that gets in the way of sort of unity amongst workers in Israel-Palestine is racism. And so, you got to remember that the kibbutzim wouldn't hire Arab workers, that the Histadrut didn't want Arab workers. So the racism comes ahead of all the ability for workers to be able to see their common issues. And I think that when you come into the country, the racism is so in your face if you choose to see it, and that's really another big issue culturally in that country. So why don't we stop and people can talk with me.
This event is being co-sponsored by Students for Justice in Palestine and JVP of Columbia University, as well as Columbia University Apartheid Vest.
In any event, I'm Zach Aldridge. I'm a member of Columbia Barnard Jewish Voice for Peace and Columbia University Apartheid Divest. We launched Columbia University Apartheid Divest last year in February, almost a year ago. And we launched a divestment campaign that is currently in the process, both for monetary divestment through the trustees of the university, and also just basically to get the word out on campus that BDS is alive and well, and that it's got momentum, and we keep hosting events about it and trying to inform as many people as possible.